It's pretty hard to get me excited about a motherboard by putting a bunch of flashy lights in my face these days. I haven't even been on the DIY PC scene that long compared to some folks, but I still feel like at this point, I've kind of seen it all and I've become jaded enough about these often barely functional features that all I want is a motherboard manufacturer to make a product that eschews all of that nonsense and gives me a back to basics board that just plain works no matter what you throw at it. I'm starting to get the feeling that deep down ASUS knows this, because in spite of the fact that they just launched like a dozen Z97 motherboards or something like that, they offered to send me a grand total of one of them, the Z97-WS, or as I'm calling it, the Linus Edition. The CM Storm SF17 uses a massive 18cm fan to cool your gaming notebook, and it adds a 4-port USB hub. Click now to learn more. The WS in the model number stands for Wonderful Stability, and when ASUS does build a board in this series on a given chipset, they only do one, because when you trim the fat and leave only the good stuff, you only need one model. It's boring looking with no LEDs, doesn't have any OC panels, carries almost no consumer-friendly features like onboard Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and lacks some of the really hardcore overclocking tuning options that you might find on an ROG series board. And yet, it costs the same as these feature-laden, race car type options. So what the heck is up with that? Well, the money that would have been spent in R&D on features that a small fraction of the user base will use gets spent on workstation-grade componentry, extremely flexible expansion, and on validating WS boards with a huge variety of hardware that goes beyond the traditional, well, it works with AMD graphics cards and NVIDIA graphics cards, so I guess it's okay treatment that many motherboards get. We're talking RAID cards, high-end NIC cards, PCIe storage cards, and even much more obscure stuff than that. All right, so what comes with it? You get an I/O shield, a USB 2/FireWire PCI bracket, a serial PCI bracket, 8 SATA 3 6GB/s cables, 2-way, 3-way, and 4-way SLI bridges, those Q connector blocks that make it easier to plug in your front switches, a manual, a driver disk, and finally, the motherboard itself. Now, I said already it's boring looking, but I guess now you guys see my point. I prefer the full-on Borgasm look with a black PCB and just plain silver accents, but I guess if I had to have a gold motherboard, I'll take a practical looking one like this over a blingy tacky one like some of the ones I've seen in the past. Our feature tour begins at the CPU socket, where we'll find support for current generation LGA 1150 Haswell and Haswell refresh processors with promises of future Broadwell support, a nice little thing to have in your pocket. Those CPUs all share a common memory support scheme, so to the right of the socket you'll find 4 DDR3 memory slots that run in dual channel mode. Power to the CPU and RAM is handled by a next generation all digital power design with 8 phases for the CPU and 2 for the memory, and it includes some pretty seriously impressive Japanese capacitors that are rated at an industry-leading 12,000 hours of operation at 150 degrees Celsius, well higher than any PC should get. On the top edge we find hardware buttons for TPU and EPU optimizations. I generally don't touch them, but if you want to, then TPU boosts CPU performance a bit and EPU reduces power consumption a little bit. Next to those switches, we've got a couple more useful switches. The MEMOK button boots the PC with super safe memory settings, so even with finicky RAM, you can get into the BIOS and make the adjustments you need to, and the XMP switch lets you enable performance-optimized memory profiles without any software configuration. This could be handy since the board does support memory speeds up to 3,300 megahertz out of the box. Moving down the right-hand side is the 24-pin connector that, aside from being in the correct position on the right-hand edge, ASUS claims is exceptional because it uses a new design that improves contact with your power supply connector, reducing the risk of burning out the contacts. Neato. Under that are 2 USB 3 front headers for a total of 10 USB 3 ports on the board, and then the Dr. Power switch that enables OS monitoring of your power supply to help you detect a failing unit. Haven't got a dead power supply that I feel like plugging into a working board to test it, but I guess that sounds pretty cool. Continuing on down, we've got either 8 SATA 3 6GB/s ports, with 6 of them coming off of an Intel chipset and 2 off of a secondary as media one, or 4 Intel SATA 3 ports, and 2 SATA Express 10 gigabit per second ports, one powered off the Intel chipset and one off the ASMedia chipset. This will provide a ton of expansion options as SATA Express drives start showing up, but it also doesn't end there. There's an M2 slot right next to them for a total of 3 SSDs that can be plugged right into PCI Express rather than just SATA for improved throughput and latency. Right on. Above the usual contingent of audio, FireWire, serial, USB 2, TPM, and front panel connector headers are the only necessary onboard buttons that you might find useful for test bench use, like power, reset, and clear CMOS. No, fancy esoteric functionality there. You'll also find a 4-digit post readout that will give you useful diagnostic information, but if you can't see it because, the numbers move too fast or because there's a graphics card in the way of the board and you can't see it, don't worry, you can dump the logs onto a USB drive using the Q-code logger button right next to the USB BIOS flashback button on the rear panel that lets you flash the BIOS without a CPU installed. Wicked expansion is another pillar of WS boards, and with 4 PCI Express Gen 3 16x slots that can simultaneously operate in 8x mode, this iteration doesn't disappoint. That means you can throw 4 AMD or NVIDIA graphics cards in here in SLI or Crossfire for gaming, or you can simply load it up with a bunch of compute cards for workstation use. You can also fill it up with Red Rockets, RAID cards, or whatever else you want to do, because boards like this are made for future growth. Love it. Just make sure that you use that 6-pin auxiliary connector above the top slot if you want to load her up, so to speak. Even the fancy 24-pin connector likely won't save the board from quad overclocked R9 290Xs if you don't use that auxiliary connector. Finishing up in the corner, we find a quality, if unexceptional, onboard audio solution that uses the Realtek ALC1150 codec. I use a separate amplifier anyway, so this is more than good enough for my needs, but if you're expecting your motherboard to drive fancy 300 to 600 ohm impedance headphones, you may want to rethink something about your setup. On the back of the board, we find some good stuff, and actually my first complaint about it. I'll start with the good stuff. 2 USB 2 ports, 6 USB 3 ports, dual Intel gigabit LAN, 7.1 analog audio out with gold-plated connectors, eSATA 6 gigabit per second, optical audio out, a DisplayPort output, and an HDMI port. Now, the glaring omission in what is otherwise a perfect workstation grade board, that mini DisplayPort connector. While it does enable 3 concurrent displays, it really should, in my mind, be a Thunderbolt 2 port on a board of this caliber. ASUS does have their Thunderbolt header to allow this functionality to be added with an add-in card, but I still wish it was on board and they weren't asking me to spend more money and waste a PCIe slot on it after the fact. Well, that was it. That was my only complaint. Aside from the stuff I just mentioned, you've got the usual ASUS essentials, including their easy-to-navigate Uefi BIOS, onboard temperature probes, their automagical fan speed tuning that can create fan speed profiles with the 6 onboard 3 or 4-pin fan headers that dynamically adapt to your system load, and finally, due to its build quality and BIOS optimization, this WS board has enough overclocking options to run with the best of them. So it's all basically there. But that's not the focus here, and you won't find marketing blurbs about that on the box or on the product page. No. While, as usual, ASUS's messaging is a little rough when they try to emphasize their quality control standards and compatibility testing, the message still gets through. And based on my experience with their WS class boards, I can't recommend anything more heartily. I still like some flashy lights on my fans and water cooling tubing or whatever, but when it comes to the motherboard, an often overlooked component that does so little for performance these days, but so much for smooth operation, I'll take a WS board any day of the week if I could choose any board on the market, which I can, so I did. Thank you for watching my overview of the Z97-WS. Just like with all of my videos, you can find a link with pricing and availability that includes my affiliate code in the video description under the like, share, and dislike buttons, which I'd love for you to use accordingly. Also in the video description is a support link where you can give us a monthly contribution, buy a t-shirt like this one, or change your Amazon bookmarks to ones that include our affiliate code so we get a small kickback whenever you buy lozenges or whatever. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as we enjoyed making it, and don't forget to mash that subscribe button if you haven't already. By the way, that bit at the beginning about how WS stands for wonderfully stable or whatever I said, stands for workstation. I was just messing with you.